Greetings. Today is 9/1/2019, and on the mathematical calendar from the Almighty, it is the 15th day of the 6th month, so the 15th day of Elul. I'm just doing this quick little video, more or less as I know it's preaching to the choir if any of you are regulars on my channel, but it's more of an in-between video because I got some major information concerning the end time Elijah and the first couple seals of Revelation that I'll be doing in my next video. So I'm basically just letting you all know, please come back and check for that next video because it's extremely critical information that is not taught in the mainstream and pretty contrary to what everybody else says about the seals. And hopefully I'll have that out for next Sabbath, so you all can watch it on the Sabbath or listen to it, whatever. But it's going to have major puzzle pieces connected concerning the end time Elijah, the anointed ruler, and the first couple seals. So this video I call the formula because Scripture basically gives us a simple formula concerning salvation, and mainstream Christianity has got it wrong. Okay. Mainstream Christianity has been leaning on their own understanding, because to get the revelation of the Scripture, you must keep the commandments. The Messiah tells us that in John 14:21. He doesn't really reveal himself to us until we start keeping his commandments, period. You can spin it, try to ignore it, or be lazy and listen to teachings that teach contrary to what I'm saying. But the fact remains is that the Messiah does not reveal himself unless you're keeping the commandments. And this is why 95% of Christianity misses the open door in heaven, and they must remain, because they're not doing it. And this is why for so long there's been so much error, confusion, and weakness. Alright, so to get what the Messiah is saying concerning his word, you must keep his commandments. And one of the main ones is observing the Sabbath, because when you look throughout scriptures, one of the main things that the ancient Israelites violated that angered the Almighty was the profaning of the Sabbath. And that brought a lot of hard times to the ancient Israelites because of that error. So, ultimately, mainstream Christianity chooses to worship the regurgitated vomit of their own false doctrines. And it's a form of harlotry. When you choose a false doctrine over truth, that's harlotry. And it's easy to see why the Almighty is so angry with the shepherds and the Messiah only allows 5% into the open door in heaven. When you step out of the box, the baloney box, and you look at Christianity as it is, it's easy to see why only a few make it into the open door in heaven. And it's very easy to see the people that are doing great things in the name of the Messiah, but then he tells them that you're lawless and doesn't let them in. It's easy to see when you understand these things. So, the author of mathematics, which is the Almighty, the Messiah, he's the one that made mathematics, not humans. Right? We just came into the understanding, more than likely from angels, but the ultimate author is the Almighty. And he gives us a simple formula to use concerning salvation. And 95% of Christianity doesn't get it right, and will ultimately miss the open door in heaven and have to remain during the 7-year trial, which is when the seals are opened. So, the open door in heaven is the first rapture, and it's the event that begins the final 14 years of the end of the age. Only the wise virgins are allowed entry. And they're allowed entry because they keep the word of his patience. So this is the formula. Keeping the word of his patience. And where is that revealed? It's revealed in Revelation 14:12. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of the Father and faith in the Son, which ultimately equals love of Father and Son. And the Messiah stresses it over and over again about keeping the commandments of the Father, doing the will of the Father. And what's the will of the Father? It's keeping his commandments, obeying his voice, etc., etc. The Messiah reiterates it over and over and over and over again. And then we see the scripture in Jeremiah 2:32 that points us to the parable of the 10 virgins, where the Almighty says, can a bride forget her gown? Or the maids, their dress? Their garments, I should say. And that's what happens. And then he goes on to say that my people have forgotten me. And as we went over before in past videos, that the bridal gear that makes you ready to enter the open door is keeping the commandments. That's what the gear is. And I believe one of the main things that the Messiah looks for when he opens the door to see if we are ready is, are we observing the Sabbath? Because if you're a Christian, a serious Christian, then more than likely you're keeping most of the commandments just by being a Christian, right? Really, there's only the only commandment that you won't be keeping is observing the Sabbath, right? And the Almighty also tells us that observing the Sabbath is his mark on his people forever. And he also tells us that keeping the commandments are a mark too. And I do believe that one of the main things the Messiah is looking for is, are we observing the Sabbath and the holy days, the feast days? And more than likely that's going to be one of the main things that separates the wise and foolish virgins, because the foolish virgins are very close to getting it right. Because they at least rate virgin status, meaning they only worship the Messiah and the Almighty, where 90% of Christianity is in harlotry. So, my point in saying all that is that the main thing people miss is love of the Father. And Jeremiah 2:32 tells us that he says, my people have forgotten me. And that's what mainstream Christianity has been doing. They focus on the Messiah, which, you know, if they were truly focused on him, they would realize that he was pointing us back to the Father, doing the will of the Father. But anyway, the formula was the same for Abraham in the beginning. It was the same for the nation of Israel, and it's the same for us today, spiritual Israel. And ultimately, it was the same for, I should have even put that in here, but it was the same for Adam and Eve back in the garden. They if they would have kept the terms of the agreement, which is obeying the Father and not eating from the fruit of the tree that he said not to, they would have lived forever in paradise. But they didn't keep their side of the terms. And that's what they ultimately ended up dying. And they brought about all this junk into our lives. So the Messiah, well, I shouldn't say he reveals it in John 8, but it's revealed. It's there. The formula is there in John 8, 1-11, when the Messiah deals with the lady caught in adultery. Okay, and then Paul reveals the formula in many places throughout Scripture. Paul tells us that grace is the gift of the Father, meaning that it's when he says grace, he's actually talking about the Messiah. The Messiah is the gift of the Father. And that's why it's a capital G. And he tells us that the promise was to the seed of Abraham, seed singular, meaning the promise was the Messiah. That's the gift. It wasn't a bloodline. People try to say that the Israelites are the Almighty's people because of the bloodline. Well, that's not true. The promise was that Abraham was going to have a seed in his bloodline, which was the Messiah. And then we have here faith by definition is an action. And when you look up faith in the Greek, it implies faithfulness, not just plain old faith. It implies faithfulness, which is a daily way of living, not just a thought or a little phrase, oh yeah, I believe. No, it's a daily way of living. And almost all the books in the New Testament tell us that faith is a daily way of living, not just a one-time choice. So why would the author of mathematics violate his laws in mathematics and say that grace plus 0 is salvation? Well, he doesn't. What happened is that mainstream Christianity did not properly dissect his word, and that is why the false teaching of once saved, always saved has continued in error all these years. Scripture does not say grace by itself equals salvation. That's a very poor, lazy interpretation of what Paul said. And frankly, it's stupid. Because you're basically saying, when you believe that, you're basically saying, the Messiah taught us left and right about keeping the commandments, doing the will of the Father, and then all of a sudden he's going to pick Paul and send him to teach us something that completely contradicts his whole life and teachings and all the declarations made by the Father. It's just ridiculous. So here is the formula. All right. So mainstream Christianity teaches that grace plus 0 equals salvation. All right. Well, that's not true. Grace, which is the gift of the Father, the Messiah plus 0 equals the Messiah. Grace. That's what grace plus 0 equals. Grace. And it's the addition and property of 0. We're talking elementary mathematics here. You learned that back in first or second grade or something like that. Whenever you add 0 to something, you get that same thing. Then we go faithfulness plus 0. Once again, addition properties of 0 equals faithfulness. And this is what he's saying, not by itself. He's saying faithfulness by itself does not equal salvation. Because if it did, then men can boast. And if faithfulness by itself equals salvation, then the Jews at the time of the Messiah, they could have earned it without the Messiah. Which was never the case. It's not the case. And that's what he was saying here in Ephesians 2. For grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of the Almighty, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. Okay? Nowhere is he saying that grace by itself equals salvation. He's saying faithfulness by itself does not equal salvation. That's what he's saying. To the contrary of grace, he's not saying grace by itself. He's saying grace through faith. Well, what does through faith means? It means you're adding it. Grace and faith equals saved. So he's not saying grace by itself here. When he says not of yourselves, it's meaning not by faithfulness by itself. You need the gift of the Almighty to be included in the faithfulness. And when he's saying not of works, same thing. He's saying faithfulness by itself does not equal salvation. Okay? And then we go back to here. So, faithfulness plus 0 equals faithfulness. And then we have grace plus believing doesn't equal salvation either. Even the demons believe and shudder. James 2:19. When you believe, it is only an observation of a fact. So when you have the Messiah plus believing that he is the Messiah, you're merely observing a fact. And that's why James says, well, even demons believe and shudder. Because it's not a big deal just to believe. You're only observing a fact. Okay? But now here we have the formula. Grace plus faithfulness. A daily living of faith in the Messiah equals salvation. Okay? And it's, like I said, it's all over. It's all over the New Testament here. Paul talks about it all over the place. And when you look at it, the Messiah shows it in John 8:1-11. And here we go. All right, so the Messiah went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came into the temple, and all the people came unto him. He sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the middle, in the midst, the center of the court, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Okay? And this is all specific here. All right? So we have a woman who, and at this point in history, women were considered less valuable than men. And she's caught in adultery. So now she's cheating on a man. And they emphasize that she was caught in the very act, meaning there's no doubt that this woman is guilty. And then they say, now in the law of Moses, we are to stone such a woman. What then do you say? And as the scripture says, they were doing this to test him because they wanted to accuse him. But the Messiah stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. And I believe what he was doing right here is that he was pointing down into the abyss and writing the law, pointing to the one who violated it first and saying, you're the one that's guilty. But anyway, he stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Then again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. When they heard this, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older, wiser ones, and then the younger ones, until there was only him and the woman who was in the center of the court. Straightening up, the Messiah said to her, Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? She said, No one, Master. And the Messiah said, I do not condemn you either. Now, this is where mainstream Christianity wants to put the finishing touches on this right here. They want to end it right here. I do not condemn you, period. And act like that's it. But that's not it. That's not the end of the story. Then he says, Go. From now on, sin no more. Okay? And this is the formula right here in this story. Right here, he is the ultimate judge. And he says, I do not condemn you. So here's the gift, the grace, the Messiah, the Master. I do not condemn you either. Because when he was stooped down on the ground with his finger writing in the dirt, he was pointing to the one that the Almighty and him put all the blame on. The original fallen angel. And then when he stands up and looks at the woman, he says, I do not condemn you either. So that's the grace. That's the gift. And then this is the plus. From now on, sin no more. Faithfulness equals salvation. The Messiah and faithfulness, sin no more, equals salvation. Not just saying, oh yeah, I believe, yeah. Yep, I believe. That's me. I'm a believer. Once saved, always saved. No, that's not how it works. From now on, sin no more. So right here is the formula in this story. Like I said, I know if you people are regulars on my channel, I'm preaching to the choir. But this is more or less for people who are on the fence, like I was a couple years ago, when you're studying and your heart's telling you, hey, I should be keeping the Sabbath. I really don't think it's once saved, always saved. Like when your heart is telling you this, but you go and you hear all these teachings saying contrary, it's confusing. It wasn't until I finally got angry with all the confusion in Christianity where I stomped my foot down and said, that's it, I'm going straight to Messiah, and I don't care what all these other people are saying. And that's when he started revealing himself to me majorly. So, as we can see, Paul is not saying that works or deeds are not part of the equation. In Ephesians 2:8, he is saying that there's two components to salvation to get the proper solution. Grace is needed in addition to faithfulness. If only faithfulness was required, then we can get into heaven by ourselves. And he said, nope, that's not it. It requires grace, the gift of the Father, which is the Messiah. And since that's required, then no one can boast about just being faithful or just, your good works, your good deeds, or whatever. Now, this formula does not violate the law of mathematics concerning the addition properties of zero, where the once saved, always saved, grace plus nothing does violate the addition properties of zero. And I'm just adding that in there to try to really pound it home that these baloney teachings and doctrines about once saved, always saved, and you don't need to keep the commandments, they're all false. And do you really want to risk it now that you've heard it? Ultimately, it's just they're just being lazy. That's what it is. It's a lot easier to say once saved, always saved. No accountability. But that's not the truth. So, Paul got it perfectly right, and mainstream Christianity is the one who has it wrong. And the numbers that Scripture gives us of who enters the open door proves how critical this component is and how it's missed by the masses. And it's just another confirmation that the Messiah was right when he said the gate is narrow and few find it. That scripture always boggled my mind, because if you believe in the once saved, always saved baloney, well then how can the gate be narrow? And how can few find it when you have billions of people acting like they're Christians? But no, the Messiah from his own mouth says the gate, and he's ultimately talking about the open door in heaven right here. He's saying the open door in heaven is narrow and few find it. And the numbers prove it. 95% miss it. And now the 7-year trial of course, there's going to be huge revival, and I believe Christianity is going to come back to the Father, because, you know, number one, they're going to see the evidence. I'm sure a lot are going to be offended and try to act like the first rapture was an alien invasion or something like that, or it was the bad people getting removed. I'm sure there's going to be some false baloney out there, but ultimately I think during the 7-year trial there's going to be a huge revival going back to the truth, to the Father, the will of the Father, and they're going to get it right. Most of them. But, and that's what this message is intended for, to help people get there. Not to fall for that baloney. Because, I mean, you know, the best thing to do is to ignore what mainstream Christianity teaches and to sink yourself into the scriptures yourself and seek the Messiah yourself. I mean, nowadays with all this technology, we don't have any excuses. The one, like this one site that I use, right here, Bible Hub. I mean, you got multiple versions. You got the interlinear Bible, which is basically the Greek and Hebrew as close as it gets. And then you can click on the words like this right here, and you see what the definitions that the concordances have. You do all this with a few clicks. 20 years ago, you had to thumb through massive amount of pages to get the information that you could do in a few clicks nowadays. And that's why the knowledge is increased, as Gabriel said to Daniel. There's no excuse nowadays, is my point. We have the software, we have the technology. Now, the only thing you got to do is step out of the box, the prison of mainstream Christianity, and seek the Messiah for yourself. And He will answer. Sometimes it's fast, sometimes it takes a couple days, but He answers. And once you get the answer, there's a peace inside, and it's like you know that this is the right interpretation. Okay, so few find it. Remember that. Mainstream Christianity does not understand the simple details of a contract. So there's at least two parties that agreed to the terms. The Father always had terms to His covenant. Right? There was always a big if. And that's why I say Israel was never a bloodline. Never. He said, all the peoples are mine anyway. Everything on earth is mine anyway. The thing that was to separate Israel was the fact that they kept His covenant. And it's the same today. The new covenant. It's the same thing. But it's not a bloodline. It's those who keep His covenant. They are Israel. They're His people. Israel just means someone who perseveres with the Almighty. And that's basically saying faithfulness. Someone who is faithful to the Almighty. That's who Israel is. Faithful to the covenant. Faithful in keeping the terms of the agreement. And the Messiah says the same thing. If you love me, then you'll obey my commands. And what are His commands? To love the Father. And how do you love the Father? By doing His will. How do you do His will? By keeping His commandments. Obeying His voice. Basically, the terms of the agreement have been the same throughout all of human history. Faith and obedience equals fulfillment of the agreement. Eden, Abraham, sons of Israel, spiritual Israel. It's all the same. Faith plus obedience equals salvation, fulfillment of the agreement. Because the Almighty said, when you do this and this, then you'll be my people and you'll be blessed, etc., etc., etc. And today it's when you have grace plus faithfulness equals salvation. Terms of the agreement. Faith that the Messiah is the Son of the Almighty. Okay, this right here. What was that? Matthew 16. Matthew 16:16. This is the one of the questions we will all ultimately have to answer. The Messiah saith unto them, who do you say that I am? That's the big question to all of humanity that the Messiah is asking us all. Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, said, thou art the anointed chosen one, the Son of the living Almighty. And that's the rock right there. This is the main foundation, this answer. He wasn't saying Peter was the rock. He was saying his answer is the rock on which the church is built. That's the first step. That you believe this. That's only the first step. Okay? Right there, that's the rock, the main foundation. And there was this one prophet, and he was very popular. I forget his name, but basically he had a vision of heaven, and he basically said that not many people made it into heaven, and that the masses missed it. And he said that when he got to the door, the question the Messiah asked him was, did you learn how to love? Okay. Now, something to understand is that, like, when you go into a court, there's definitions within the court of law that will mean the definition will be nothing of what the definition is outside of law. And an example is, like, for instance, traffic. Like, when you think of traffic, you think of cars or whatever. But in the court of law, traffic is actually the movement of commerce. So it's the movement of commerce. So where when you think of it, or I think of it, in terms outside of a court of law, our definition doesn't mean that. And it's the same principle with something like love. Like, when we think of love, we think of, this and that and this. But the Messiah tells us what his version of love is. He says, if you love me, then obey my commandments. And like we talked about earlier, the commandments are the 10 commandments. And, people try to say, well, it was them 2 commandments. But anybody who says that doesn't have insight into what the Messiah is talking about. Because the first thing he says is, you'll love the Father with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. And if you're loving the Father, well then, what are you doing? You're doing His will if you love Him. And what's His will? Keeping the commandments, obeying His voice. So like that's a ridiculous argument saying, well, He only had 2 commandments. Yeah, but what He was saying was that if you do them 2 commandments properly, then you're fulfilling all the commandments, because you'll be doing all the commandments. Because that's what love is, according to Him and the Father. If you love Him, you obey Him. Meaning, when that guy had that vision and he was in heaven, and at the gate, at the door, and the Messiah asked him that question, he wasn't asking the question saying, love in the term of how we think. When he was saying, did you learn how to love? What he was saying was, do you keep my commandments? And you remember a long time ago when we did that video, now that you know what the Messiah's version of love is, keeping the commandments, go back to that chapter on love in Corinthians and replace love with keeping the commandments. And that puts a whole different perspective on things. Because the Messiah's version of love, loving Him, is keeping His commandments. So, faith in the Messiah, obeying the commandments. Abraham had faith. He believed that the word of the Almighty was true, but it didn't stop there. It said, and Paul reiterates this. He said, he didn't just believe that the word of Almighty was true, but he believed and acted upon it by picking up his family and leaving like the Almighty told him to do. And that's the faithfulness, obeying. So he believed the word and then acted in faithfulness and left. And these are the terms of the agreement. Grace plus faithfulness. And they were the same back in Exodus, and they're the same for us. And the wise virgins are the first ones to accomplish these simple requirements, and they get blessed, rewarded by entering the open door and being kept from the hour of trial. So instead of being stuck here for another 7 years in the trial, they're in heaven, in New Jerusalem, around the altar, performing in the capacity like the Levites in the olden days. So basically they're going to be acting like the priests, working in the temple, while everybody else is down here going through the trial. Alright, that's about all I have. I hope this helped. And like I said, I really just wanted to give you all a heads up that the next video I have is extremely critical in understanding the near future. Especially if anybody is here during the trial. I have no idea if I'll be here or not. I'm praying and doing the best I can that I won't be, but I'm not saying that I'm definitely going to be here or definitely not going to be here. But so I encourage you all to come back, check that next video out. And until then, may the will of the Almighty be done in the name of His only begotten Son, Yahushua. Take care.